The language of movement is written in feel, not in words and pictures, and I can prove it. Most babies get a command of walking without a lot of visual imagery or without a lot of verbal instruction. Now, that's not to say they don't hear the words and they don't see other people walking, but they must pattern themselves based on the way gravity feels, their center of mass over their base of support feels, and they work it out. And believe it or not, I think they actually do it as quick as they do.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us, and we're sorry about the technical difficulties. I'm Ashley with FMS, and today in the studio we have FMS co-founder Gray Cook, continuing part 2 of his Conflicted series. During the presentation, our team of experts are available to answer questions regarding today's topic, so feel free to submit in the chat and the comment areas. And make sure to stick around till the end of the live for a Q&A session. An exclusive promotion code will also be given, so you'll want to stay tuned. All right, Gray, let's get started.
Thanks, Ashley. For those of you joining us for the first time, this is the second in a series of some conflicted moments that I've had in my own development and bouncing off these debates within the 4 walls of my own brain, but also within the walls of FMS with my partners and colleagues, and trying to get to some sense of platform on movement, because the movement landscape that we train to work with is not the movement landscape in front of us. People are changing in quicker ways than we've ever seen before, and we've got to have ways to discuss that in a sensitive and practical manner. So I've had some conflicts in my evolution as a healthcare professional in musculoskeletal medicine and as a movement professional, as a strength conditioning coach. And so a conflict that I wanted to get through is training prioritized in 2 words, respond and adapt. And I want to make sure that a lot of our fundamental assumptions get converted to fundamental knowledge, because we make a lot of assumptions that what we're doing, as long as we're moving somebody around, must be better than them just sitting, and yet exercise is now a risk factor for injury, meaning that we're doing too much exercise to the wrong people, or the wrong people are picking the wrong exercises and vice versa. So the solution can somehow often present more problems if we don't have structure and systems. And that's why we call this thing functional movement systems, because we saw people with more time and freedom to exercise than ever before, and yet losing function in a measurable way. And that takes me back to the first talk I did, Conflicted, which was parts versus patterns. So many of our rehab, exercise, and sports performance discussions wind up talking about a body part. You can't get through one day on ESPN without the ACL getting mentioned or something else. And yet, when we look at musculoskeletal injuries, it's not the body part that necessarily failed. It's all the risk factors that were stacked on that probably set up that situation. When I did that talk a few weeks back for you guys, I wanted to end that talk with the platform where this one starts. I talked about, I learned as a PT and as a strength coach how to really go down local and measure certain variables in certain body parts. But we also knew that if people couldn't put it together in competition, real life, and real activities, that something was being lost. And so we needed a global scale, not to replace fine-tuned local measurements, but this is the whole body moving in these local measurements. If we reconcile those 2 measurements, we're on the right track. And if we can't, we need to basically prioritize what's happening. So I've brought you up to speed on the fact that we can't pick either or. We have to have local and global representations of mobility, stability, and movement to really make sure that today's population, a population this planet's never seen before, can actually use exercise in a constructive way or rehabilitation in a sustainable way to basically move the risk factors of a lot of the injuries that are unnecessary. One of my goals is to quit treating preventable injuries and prevent them on the front end. But we got to think like an epidemiologist or a biologist about movement. We can't simply keep throwing exercise at global dysfunction and hoping it changes. that brings you to the fact that if you think you have a remedy or a solution for something, is it more beneficial to add a positive or to remove a negative? And I think that because so many of us put together rehabilitation programs and exercise and athletic development programs that involve both protective measures, corrective measures, and development measures, it's real easy to think we're doing it all. And we blend it all together. But we must identify before we ever try to add a benefit or a positive to movement. Is movement being disadvantaged, or are the learning systems in movement not optimized so the lesson plan can take root? And so what I want you to understand is, I learned this early on in healthcare. Before I add a positive, I must look at all the negatives that could be removed. Are you hydrated? Are you rested? What are some things that can influence your balance and inflammation that have nothing to do with your mobility and stability treatment, but have everything to do with the treatment being received? So yes, we do want to correct things when we find them, but one of the biggest flaws that I've seen FMS expose in an elegant way is the fact that we're so busy trying to correct the bad movement pattern we saw that we're not looking at what caused the bad movement pattern in the first place, and maybe setting up a much better corrective exercise with a few more things, like we could be doing this, this, and this as well. So we need to protect people from excessive loads. And we talk about lifestyle, but we never talk about anybody's work style. We talk about their workout or their lack of activity, but when we talk about work, we talk about loads. And sometimes I don't think that you can have a good enough 45-minute workout to negate all of the negatives of sitting all day and slouching around and breathing up in your chest and just doing a lot of things on this cortisol junkie that we do. So trying to add one positive corrective to a negative lifestyle probably won't work. But if we know those things we want to protect you from, I really think we can do it. And so the second principle that I've tried to stick with in FMS, when trying to look at movement and make sure we have a standard of well before we coach up often, I also think it's important when we go to movement with our remedy, with our engineered approach of returning you to function, we know what to protect you from before we start debating the many different ways we could correct you. Protecting you is what we're not going to do for a while. Correcting you is what we're going to agree to do differently, and development is what we're going to continue doing because we can measure that it's working. And at any given time, we may be correcting one part of you and still developing another part of you, and that's called elegant programming and creativity. But if we don't identify and compartmentalize these things and actually talk about them in compartments, it's real easy to make assumptions when you should have knowledge before moving further, because as I said, the landscape of movement is more diverse and different than it's ever been, and the risk factors are actually getting very self-evident, and we can make people's awareness align with that if we do it in the right way. Let me ask you something. When somebody's got a mobility problem, there are certain things we definitely don't want to do with them that would probably allow their programming or rehab to make things worse. I could also say that in motor control, stability, timing, and coordination, when somebody's having major problems, long before we offer the remedy or the exercise solution, what are some things we could do to protect that situation from getting worse? Think about that for a second. And before I populate that box for you, how are you going to fill up the box on mobility? What do we want to protect a person with a mobility problem from? And right there, we want to take that postural load down. We want to make things a little bit easier on the proprioceptive awareness of posture. And how do babies do that? Well, when they're having a hard day crawling, rolling is still an option. When they're having a hard day walking, crawling is still an option. So they have no problem reducing the postural load to gain an advantage. Neurological complexity. And the other things that I want you to see are the breathing and the way that we're coming at the situation. So if there's anything in mobility that's going to cause compensation, we try to remove that. Well, how do we feed motor control? Exactly the same way. Too many of us are so focused on correcting a pattern that we don't realize that unless we lower that meal, unless we lower that dietary load of movement, they're probably not going to be able to digest everything appropriately. And so we do need to protect. And many times I talk about today's client or patient is somebody who would expect the mechanic to run alongside the car and repair it while it's running 55 miles an hour. They park it and pop the hood, and then we work on things. And so many people want to blend a corrective into a toxic workout. There's not enough corrective on the planet to overtake the toxic workout or the toxic lifestyle. So your work style, I got to question that. And if these things I need to be protecting you from are part of that, we got to change that temporarily so we can at least give the corrective a chance. Now, when we're looking at the corrective, that is a constricted path. Well, we all think our correctives are targeted, but many of us base our correctives on body parts, not movement patterns, which is why we always realized we needed a movement scale. And when we constrict that path, what we mean is there are certain activities that don't have anything to do with the corrective process, and there are some activities that rub you right up against that mobility and or stability problem. But at the end of that little path or journey is a feedback loop that you don't get to talk about. It's one you must express through your movement, and it's called retest. And if we look at both the local and global measurables of that retest, we will know that this corrective was digested, meaning you are different at the end of a corrective than you were before. Now, when we develop somebody, we got to throw load and stress and all kinds of physical capacities on you. And 4 to 6 weeks from now, we measure a different person. And that different person has adapted to something. But back up in correction, we see a change in a single session. And I want you to consider what we're doing when we're trying to correct a movement pattern as well as try to develop a movement pattern. The SAID principle is specific adaptation to impose demand. And I think almost every exercise decision we've made in the last 30 years just thinks if we press the system, it'll bounce back stronger. And a normally operating system will. But 60% of Americans have one chronic health disease right now, so I don't know if we've got a majority of normally responding systems, so I don't know if the SAID principle is something that we can just throw hard work at situations and hope a more robust specimen pops out of the other side. We all talk about it and we all realize that we need a little bit of physical stress to grow and maintain, but let's truly understand the process of adaptation. The SAID principle is not in play when protection and correction are in question. And protection and question rarely were in question in earlier populations and robust physical cultures because we were all pretty functional. We didn't really have humans that couldn't squat or balance on one foot because people had to do a lot of stuff and they had to walk around a lot. But right about World War II, we started seeing a physical decline in movement even in school-age kids, and we didn't know why. And the end result of that is in many professions that require physical demands, we simply lowered physical standards instead of asking the question why. It doesn't take a lot of research to see that trend. All of a sudden, we're not meeting the bar. It is a knee-jerk reaction to lower the bar. And as a temporary adjustment, that might be beneficial, but nobody's ever put it back to where it was. And yet we have aspirations of all of the physical cultures that came before us, and we're not doing what they did. So you will adapt in a hopefully robust and successful way in your specific environment if you don't have things we need to protect you from, and if you don't already have responses that need to be corrected. What do I mean by that? Well, when you ask somebody to balance on a foot and their immediate reaction is to simply start flapping their arms like a bird flying, they don't know how to shift their weight appropriately, so they're already ready to make all the compensations that anybody with poor balance would. And so how do we regain balance? Well, balance is subconscious. The number one way balance works is you don't think about it, so you can carry on conversations and walk and stuff at the same time. But yet when we see people with bad balance, the very first thing most of us do is articulate it and overcoach it instead of letting balance grow out of an obstacle that was fed through a protective and corrective environment. Conflict one. If you can move better after a series of simple moves, meaning the warm-up doesn't just warm you up physiologically, it actually changes your movement screen or your balance test or some other fundamental expression of a human pattern. What does that say about your state of readiness? And a lot of people may not be familiar with this term, but if you've worked in pro athletics, you realize that athletes show up different every day. And the coach and the trainer and the sports medicine staff that can recognize fluctuations in the state of readiness realize that the program must have an audible each day, because there are lifestyle stressors and emotional stressors and physical capacity stressors that must all be calculated. And you're either showing up ready today, a little bit more than ready, or below the cut. And if you're showing up below the cut, the program we had planned for you may need to be adjusted because it may be too much for you today. That state of readiness is something we worry about with top-end operators, but let's take that down to the very, very fundamental aspects of physical education, personal training, group exercise, and rehabilitation. How many risk factors are you willing for the people you work with to have while you're still expecting them to consume a lesson plan? And we're going to talk more about these risk factors that are not just going to maybe make musculoskeletal activities more risky for people, but also inhibit their ability to adapt and learn simply because their lesson plan is well constructed, but not for this generation or not for this person today. I talked about an equation in the first conflict talk I did, and I said, you know, there was a point in time where mobility plus strength equaled movement and nobody had to look back, and that was basic math. Well, we can actually measure reliably a movement pattern or mobility with fairly good accuracy. What we've had a hard time doing is coming up with good motor control tests that actually predict whether somebody will move well or not. So if it's harder to predict motor control, then we can put an X right there, do some algebra, and if you've got mobility, that means you have the freedom to put your body in a position. But do you have the control to get there, hold there, and get back out of there? And that is what equals your movement patterns. So if mobility is good and movement patterns are bad, we investigate motor control and we can break it down. But if mobility and movement are good, we must assume that at least at that level tested, motor control is at least accommodating what we need of the freedom we have. So X equals the neurological system disadvantaged. So if there's anything you could do, just resetting your breath or doing a little bit of soft tissue warm-up, if that changes your ability to exercise, then that's all well and good, but are you going to do that forever, or you're going to try to figure out why you needed that in the first place and why your state of readiness is so compromised because one day you may not have the 12.6-minute warm-up available to you or the exact density foam roll available to you, the time or whatever to do that. So if you need the corrective, that's good, but if you're not shucking the corrective or these upgrades and you can't work out without them, then there's something else or some other questions you could be asking. Now, the SAID principle goes back to about 1958. A Dr. Henry, a professor of exercise and physical education, was basically talking about, you know, if you're going to have specific development of a physical skill or attribute, just exercising the muscles alone may not be enough. And I don't think he was saying it exactly the way I am, but at the same time, it's really easy to think you can build an athlete in a gym, and you can't, although the gym is an asset for athletes that know how to use it. So we've got plenty of examples of athletes that never had a gym. But once the gym is used, we realize we don't necessarily always generate better athletes unless they follow the rules. And he extended a lot of the specific adaptation to the areas of motor learning. And if we look at the analogy of the checkerboard and chessboard, the landscape is the same, the playing field is the same, but they are completely different. When we get into overhead throwing sports, swinging sports, and rotation sports, it's really easy to see how the shoulder is vulnerable. And it's also really easy to see how strengthening the shoulder may have temporary effects and at least accelerate rehabilitation. But is it better to assume that all people with external rotation can throw, or is it better to say that all throwers should have a certain baseline strength and external rotation? If you must continually supplement this, maybe somewhere else in the system is throwing unnecessary stress to the shoulder, and these prophylactic measures wouldn't be necessary if an ounce of prevention was used. So we got to ask these questions, and I think the SAID principle allows us to do that. Sometimes the solution for your weakness isn't just the kinesiological strengthening remedy. It's to answer, why am I weak, and why only in this quad, and why only in the lunge pattern but not in a single leg stance pattern. So movement is complicated, and our responses are usually a lot more to do with inhibition and facilitation, neurological terms, than strength and tightness and weakness are. And so there's a lot of neurological override there, and sometimes the skill or whole activity is more informative to the system. Here's why. Dr. Henry even then was talking about the sensory stimuli of movement, and the way you move are closely associated. When you exercise, we tell you what to do. When you throw a football through a spare tire hanging from a rope a few feet away, you know what to do. The tire's supposed to go through that, and there's a lot of trigonometry and hand-eye coordination and balance and rotation that go into that, and yet that feedback, that stimuli, that nonverbal coaching is the way we learn most things we do before we start talking in the first place. Most of our fundamental movement patterns are developed and in place by the time we could talk about them. And so it tells you that we must really prize this nonverbal way that the obstacle teaches movement, as long as freedom and control are available, and it's a scaled experience. And most of us don't coach our kids how to walk, but we do provide a safe environment. That means we've got plenty of protection around for them to make the mistakes necessary to refine the mechanism. And I think if we have this illusion that if we coach a mistake-free exercise or rehab session, somehow that's going to be sustainable. It's not. If they don't own it without you coaching it, it's not theirs and you're renting it. A lot of people like to rent stuff because it creates a return model, but when you have little fluctuations in the economy or social distancing, it's better to teach people how to value the experience and grow from that, always knowing that if they want to grow further, they'll keep coming back to you. Don't want you to think the SAID principle was invented in 1958. Milo of Croton was a either mythical or non-fictional character in the Greek history. It's such a fundamental story to almost every strongman culture, strength conditioning culture, that I actually borrowed that story and restated it in the front of Athletic Body and Balance. That was the first book that I solely had my name on the front of. And Milo basically is said to have picked up a young bull calf and walked around with him as part of his regime of training. And obviously there's some periodization in there, because I think he timed the growth and age of that little bull calf with maybe the Olympics or some type of regional games or city or state supported games. He was a wrestler. And I think it was quite intimidating for his opponents to see him with a fully grown bull, according to myth, on his shoulders walking around, and I got to wrestle that guy. But if we go back to this little calf on a big guy's shoulders, it's no big feat. But if you know anything about farm animals, I'm thinking that calf is going to put on about 2.5 pounds a day being fed right. That calf is going to get more docile and tame, and Milo's going to really get his angles and postures right. I don't know if you realize this, but he's doing way more carries than lifts, because walking with the cow's carrying it, he's only got to lift it and set it down once. And so there's a lot of postural control and load built in there. So a lot of stories that the SAID principle has always given us, if you work a muscle, it's going to get bigger, are right there in Milo's story. But I think the best thing about the story is Milo didn't get strong in a hurry, and it was built into the narrative that he can stay strong longer if he doesn't try to hack that, if he develops that strength in a natural progression. The same way the calf is growing in size, Milo was growing in strength and function and work capacity. And so there is a physical growth of the animal right along the physical development of a human. And there's a lot more in that story, but I think that's the very first time the SAID principle was articulated in a way that demonstrates both patience, fortitude, and planning. And those are a lot of the things that aren't part of today's workout, because we want it 7 minutes ago, quicker than somebody else got it. And so you don't get strong in a hurry, so why do we try to buy it, and why do some of us still try to sell it? It's not really a sustainable thing, and it doesn't take many failed diets or exercise plans to see that although you were well-intentioned trying to reorganize your diet or your work style, your workout life, that you didn't make the right choices, and therefore your body, your personality, and your lifestyle didn't mesh with this new thing you adopted, and it fell by the wayside just like every other fashion trend you picked up. Now, the SAID principle is a little bit of a dichotomy, because if you are ready for stress and load, and if you're ready to sort of bounce off the world and take your lumps and bumps and bruises and blisters and calluses, the world will be there to teach you. And if you do it right, you will positively adapt to the environment that you got to be in. If you do too much of that and not enough general stuff, you will over-adapt and have this myopic approach. And that's what we call over-specialization. And it's not a problem until something changes. And sometimes your health changes, sometimes the game changes, or sometimes you got to change to stay in the game. And if you've over-adapted or highly specialized, you lose the one thing that I don't think anybody ever wanted to lose, working out or becoming special, is their ability to change into something different if needed. Now, the SAID principle can work negatively as well. Now, you guys might not remember this little snapshot, but it was from a Disney movie named WALL-E, where we advanced into the future enough to say that, you know, the priorities were convenience, entertainment, and moving as little as possible or being uncomfortable as little as possible, until we had a culture that pretty much said, if I don't have to move to be entertained, I won't. And we're right there. Most of us have our greatest amount of entertainment right now sitting instead of doing something else. And, you know, that's a question on us. So this didn't happen to those people in the future. This is exactly what they asked for. But what I want you to know is, when you eat an inappropriate diet and then that's compounded by inappropriate work styles, meaning too much compressed work instead of a lot of activity, you basically will have an insulin problem. And the best way to handle an insulin sensitivity problem is to put on a lot of extra weight. That it's less dangerous for your system to have that extra buffer. So that is the SAID principle working in a dysfunctional way to basically help you survive a dysfunctional lifestyle and really dysfunctional work style. That means that you're not going to want to investigate some of your worst bad habits, but they're probably closely connected with the behaviors that either cause risk or lead to dysfunction. So, you know, replacing a bad habit with a good habit is usually a better switch than just trying to cold turkey quit a bad habit. And you may have some habits that interfere with what we call a healthy night's sleep, or you're already always trying to figure out better ways to hydrate or something like that, or can't find that diet that keeps your energy up and keeps your body comp where you want it. I really want to take this back to, you've got to look at responses and adaptations if you're going to get answers to these questions. Are you programming to correct movement or condition movement? And I think probably the very first time I had this discussion in a healthy way was with Alan Cosgrove, and he said, you know, after a corrective, we expect people to move better. And after a hard conditioning workout, we actually expect people to have that little bit of a beat down. You actually feel worse after conditioning and better after correction. And nobody's saying that beat down isn't necessary sometimes, because you've got to push the limits to find out where they are. But I think what happened was, we've got a culture now that feels so sad and behind the curve that they push the limits every workout, instead of well before often. And I've been saying it a lot of different ways for a long time. We've got to have a standard for well, because often reinforces that. But if you get over to often before you cover the well, SAID goes in the other direction. So, last time, in the last talk I did, Conflicted One, Parts versus Patterns, I talked about Neuro Man and Muscle Man. And Muscle Man is on the front of every magazine, both for males and females throughout the world. Neuro Man is what's going on behind the scenes, and you don't know what he's doing unless you get a video. So you can get a pretty good idea of Muscle Man from a still picture. But I think the people in the arts and dance and gymnastics, athletics, and in amazing, elegant things that we see all over the world in just human lifestyle, is the neurological system is really at its best seen through whole patterns and the way the body is used as a single, inseparable, complementary unit, not as a bicep curl. So Neuroman needs to have a good, self-evident representation of what's acceptable and what's not. And I've seen it. I've seen it with athletes who recognize that I'm through rehab, and I know you say I'm good, but my balance doesn't feel quite right. Until we started looking at them with the Y-balance test, we could not see what they were already feeling. But it also works where many people don't think they have a balance problem, and something as simple as a motor control screen, one small sliver of the Y balance test, can put them in a category that we can now have a healthy discussion. I know you don't feel like you have a balance problem, but I just measured that you do. And that's no different than saying, I know you don't feel like you have a blood pressure problem or a visual problem, but we just measured that you do. Now that you're aware of it, we can get on with it. But if they're not aware they have a balance problem, and if you don't have an unbiased and objective measurable scale, you're just trying to tell a story instead of trying to take that assumption and turn it into a fact that was measured. And the cool thing is, if you follow the rules of the way the Neuro man likes to get his information, you can quickly change that balance better than if you try to use the SAID principle to change that balance. You know where I'm going with this. Okay. The SAID principle, the biological imperative here is, why don't you get your software straight before you demand new hardware? Why don't you optimize the neurological system, the synergy, coordination, and timing of the body before you demand tissue growth? You better change your mind or you'll never see your body change in a meaningful way. And you can take that any way you want to, but those first 4 to 6 weeks of strength training, when you make that huge gain in strength doing a new pattern, and yet the tissue doesn't really tell that story. Now the tissue's getting ready to, because you are getting ready to adapt, because what have you been doing? You've been refining and myelinating and greasing that groove to get all the bugs worked out of that software. That application has grown more robust, and it went from 1.0 to 28.0 in a matter of days. Now your body says, okay, I will allocate the precious resources of tissue development, bone density, and reorganization of your structure to this. It seems like we're going to be doing this activity for a long time, and it seems like you did it long enough to refine all the bugs. It's a good thing we didn't adapt until now, or we would have wasted tissue, calories, and resources building a bone spur instead of a thicker tibia, because now you're a runner. So that's the way I want to think about this. We got to think about this like a biologist. We wouldn't want to start our adaptation process early in a new activity, because you got to work out the bugs. You got to become a sensing, feeling being. You got to become self-aware, and things have to become self-evident, and all of a sudden you're not in the way of your learning. You're an asset to your learning because you're becoming more sensitive. That's called deliberate practice, and it's in a lot of different books where people develop a skill, but nobody ever talks about developing that skill before you stabilize the base. And that's the problem. Too many of us want to adapt a new skill, not realizing that our soil is not ready for that seed. We've been in a pretty toxic environment, and we have a lot of assumptions about movement, as I said, we can no longer make. We've been on an eroding landscape of measurable functional movement since World War II compared to the rest of the world. Unfortunately, they're getting more like us than we were getting like they were at the time of the first measurement. Meaning, I think the natural obstacles have been taken away, and we've largely designed exercise around our problems. And even though they give us a chance to exercise, they do not restore the functional mechanism that allows us to adapt easily and move freely from environment to environment, picking up the signals of, do I need more mobility here or more control here, and what movement patterns need to be refined. Those things used to be self-evident because we didn't have a lot of coaches and therapists and chiropractors and PE teachers to fix things. We had to fix them ourselves, and usually the toil that life gave us did it just fine because we learned how to manage that stress being self-aware. Long before we get positive adaptation, we should have a positive response. And everybody agrees with that, but how are you going to measure a positive response? That means you've got a single session change. And let me go one step further. In something you didn't practice. We would all expect anything that we practice for a session to get better by the end of the session. But what if I measure your balance, your single leg stance, your Y balance test, motor control screen, whatever, at the beginning of a therapeutic session, and we do a lot of ground-based stuff and rolling around and just patterning and learning to move, no routine, no verbal feedback, roll to your left. Was that difficult? Uh-huh. Try it this way, try it that way, try it this way. And we simply let you repattern yourself in an earlier posture, laying on the ground, kneeling, quadruped, half kneeling, whatever. At the end of the session, if we go back and measure something like grip strength or your breath hold time for a breathing screen, or more importantly, your balance, and these things are getting better without practicing them, basically what we're doing is helping the system reorganize at a level where it could and didn't have to compensate. And that's the whole problem. Anytime we offer up an exercise that even requires a small degree of compensation, we actually reinforce the compensation, not the corrective solution. So if you're not measuring positive responses in things you didn't practice at the end of that corrective session, there's a good chance that you did exercise, but you didn't change the well part. You just exploited the often part. And I had to be sensitive to that in my own programming and rehab before I could really talk about it this way. We're not simply made to adapt to workouts. We're going to basically adapt to our repeated environments, lifestyles, and workloads or work styles. Like I said, a half hour or an hour of hard activity, I don't think negates a day of sitting. It's better than doing nothing, but I honestly think more activity snacks during the day and then a workout of variety and choice, unless you're specializing, once a day would be far better and probably wouldn't have to be so hard or robust, meaning it's, we say first move well, then move often, but how often are you reinforcing well movement and how often are you just moving with no feedback loop at all, because that is all part of the aggregate of your awareness. And if 50% of your movements are not good and the only movements that are good are in the gym, there's a lot more going on out there than over here. So it's got to have carryover, and I think that's one of the biggest assumptions in exercise is going to have carryover. Chess and checkers don't have carryover, and this right here only has carryover when a thrower is weak in the rotator cuff. It doesn't make better throwers, and so we need to think of things that way. Now, when we offer up exercise, let me just remind us that we offer exercise, and exercise is supplementation in most of our offerings. And your supplements do not replace food. Your exercises do not replace activity. And we encourage activity because activity can be spontaneous and activity becomes habit almost better than exercise does. So if we're truly going to change your active lifestyle, exercises may be a path to get there. And what we call your activity may very well look like exercise to another. But once it's part of your habit and routine, it is actually an activity. And as long as that activity is practiced above the level or at the level of well, you're not reinforcing compensation. And that we shouldn't see a decline in your function if you're practicing that way. But we must realize that usually if you're growing your own food, you don't have to exercise, and if you don't, you probably do. And so there's something in a more physically active lifestyle that takes care of so many of the functional problems that we've had to program around for the last 20 years. And so once we get those functional problems managed, let's not think that they need a diet of supplementation or a diet of correctives. Let's think that if we made better activity and exercise choices with what we transition them into, they would become self-aware, meaning when these activities become difficult, I realize I'm sliding backward in my functional landscape. A screen can confirm that, but I'd rather make that self-evident with a few simple activities each day. Secondly, when you have a functional problem, you've got to acknowledge that it's a subconscious problem. Most people who do poorly on the movement screen or get a 1 on a movement pattern are trying very hard not to, and they cannot overcome their lack of single leg stance, their lack of a lunge on one side, their inability to push up, or their lack of a squat. But yet we try to fix many of these subconscious problems with instruction instead of putting them through a proprioceptive or physical experience. And those physical experiences really change us in a much quicker way than verbal instruction. And when we get up into high skill, of course we need verbal instruction and we need expert feedback. But you shouldn't have to have expert feedback to learn to crawl, because every one of us did it without expert feedback. You simply have to have the freedom, and you'll know if you got the control. The takeaway that I want us to get here is, if you know somebody has some functional issues, functional problems, you've measured it or you just observed it. I would always recommend measuring it. But the positive indicators of response. If I know that you had poor balance or poor mobility or something like that, I can easily see if a single session changed you. And I think we just want the warm-up to change you. But at the end of the session, if you've lost the benefits of that corrective or warm-up, then how much of it was reinforced and how much was not reinforced? So a lot of us have these goals we want to adapt to: a leaner frame, a more muscular frame, a stronger lower body, better speed and rotation. So we've got these adaptations we want to make. But if we can't document positive responses in our sessions on those things that we need to be protected from or do differently, corrected, I'm not quite so sure we can develop ourselves to there on that shaky platform. Remember what we said. Development is a good path, that's a success path, but how many things should we be protecting you from and correcting before we really put that stress down? Because stress locks in the form that you're currently giving us, and if that form is, say, an FMS with a lot of ones or a lot of asymmetries or a YBT that demonstrates really poor balance, do you really want to lock in that form? Oh no, I know your schedule, I know your agenda. Do you really want to lock in that form? And I realize it's going to be hard and inconvenient, but it's simple. I didn't say it was easy, it's just simple. Conflict too, the neurological system needs to respond well, so often can cause tissue and system adaptation. And so if we don't have time to measure well, I really don't know if we're the ones that have time to recommend often. And that's what I mean by these principles and the way we use these feedback loops. Every one of us was blown away in the early days of functional movement systems when we took all these great exercises that we learned and threw them at corrective, and they weren't changing functional movement. And then I'm like, oh, these were said exercises. These were exercises that assumed you were moving well and you needed your loads and capacities administered this way to get good, safe tissue growth without risk. And that's not what it was at all. We were assuming that a lot of these exercises would also make movement better on the way. It's a completely different way of exercising, and that's what forced us to sort of quit doing the parts approach and really start feeding the neurological system and letting Mr. Kinesiology stand in the corner for about a month and let Mr. Neurology actually start getting the band working together before we isolated or implicated any one instrument as the bottleneck or the weak link. Now, back to the equation. And I'm going to keep going here because you can measure mobility if you understand goniometry or have an iPhone with one of those little inclinometers on it. And if you've got time to at least look at the movement screen, you'll see that I'm sure there are going to be other ways to look at movement one day, but we've got a good global capture, and it's been around for a while, and it's not really broken. So if we can measure mobility and we can measure movement, and movement's not good, then we've got to go to motor control. But motor control or whatever's in the Xbox necessitates we've got to protect you before we try to correct you. What does that mean? Well, if you're dehydrated and sleep deprived and living on painkillers, I'm not quite so sure a corrective movement strategy is really the next thing we need to do. I don't even know what you look like well rested, well hydrated, well fed, and without symptom management. So there are some things we could easily do to get a better movement measure without even telling people to exercise. Change your state of readiness or mitigate your risk factors, and you may already be moving much better than you think. And now we pick up there with your exercise menu and we work back from there. But I honestly think the said principle goes the wrong way for many of us and many of the people we work with because we're assuming that they're ready to adapt and they aren't even responding correctly. Okay, I'm taking you back. This is Gray Cook, fresh off a sports medicine degree, going to University of Miami, and to let you know how long that was ago, there was a TV show long before there was a movie called Miami Vice, and yeah, it was right about that time. Anyway, University of Miami taught me more about Neuro Man than any of the 4 years of education that I had before. I knew muscle man in and out, and I knew kinesiology. I was ready for anatomy. But the way the human neurological system is set to program and refine itself blew me away. As I was going through my education at Miami, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, using fewer words, proprioceptive cues, that means nonverbal teaching of movement is an unbelievable fact. It's a natural phenomenon, and it can be developed into a therapeutic technique. The problem was PNF was all in communication of where I put my hands and how I helped you move your body through spiral and diagonal patterns. And the resistance denotes the movement. The way I placed that contact not only touched you, but provided resistance, actually allowed you to move in paths that you wouldn't have explored for a long, long time on your own. And so I fast-tracked that natural way of offering that sensory stimuli back to the system. How's that beneficial? Well, we didn't use it a lot in musculoskeletal exercise because we were too busy measuring how strong people's quads were back then. But we used it when people were brain injured or had strokes, or we used it with handicapped kids that had a neurological disorder. And we realized that talking to those people didn't get their system tuned as quickly as touching and moving and offering sensory stimuli to those people. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, why don't we use some of that benefit in orthopedic and musculoskeletal medicine? Because why are we making the assumption that the neurological system, the one that's going to adapt first here and give us positive indicators with response, why are we assuming that's optimized? So I went to one of my professors and I said, how could I bring what I just envisioned in proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation over to strength conditioning so I could say, hey, let's not assume that muscle man is ready for stress. Let's basically tune the system even more. If we're going to assume the system is normal, let's still not assume it's optimized. So we developed a jump study, and the reason we use the jump is the vertical leap has always been one of the easiest athletic maneuvers to measure. And it does not discriminate to size because gravity affects all bodies equally. So vertical leap is a great way to get a quick snapshot of global body relative power without a lot of equipment. Okay? So we basically wanted to put people in one of three groups, 25 males, 25 females, randomly assigned to three different groups. A control group was basically told to get on a platform and jump 10 times as high as they could with very little time between each jump. Don't reset each jump, just up and down 10 times. Practice jumping and practice getting as high as you can. Second group was given a waist harness with big bungee cords, pulling them down really, really hard, making it very, very hard for them to jump, but you could see how this was coming from sort of a SED mentality. This was very popular at the time. Jumping against resistance gave us that slamming you into the ground, big eccentric load, and maybe helps the lower body component of jumping. Whereas if we were trying to facilitate the pattern of jumping first, we wouldn't overload the obvious driver of jumping, which is the legs. We would be sensitive to the entire mechanism of jumping. We would lower the resistance, but increase the range with what that resistance was applied. So a small bungee cord in the hands was also offered as the third, or I'm going to call it reactive neuromuscular training. Let me tell you why. The people jumping on their own with no resistance really had no feedback. Everybody thought, well, I jumped great 10 times, because we all think we're probably much better than we are. The group that had the heavy bungees but only resisted from the waist down got a heavy load to the legs, and I'm absolutely sure if that were done very vigorously for 4 to 6 weeks, we'd get some leg development. But I don't know if we would have put that leg development on a good or bad jumping pattern. By taking a small bungee cord and putting it in the hands and being told to jump high 10 times and really turn it around, what we found out is people who were jumping up and off to the left or leaving their arms too far in front of them or hyperextending when they jump quickly learned that the bungee cords pulled them further in the direction of their mistake, thus magnifying the biomechanical error in a nonverbal way. We refine their movement by amplifying their mistake, and their system for the first time heard the mistake as loud and clear as we were seeing it. But we didn't have to say a word because within 10 jumps, they were in that central cylinder of jumping. Now, a couple of things. We didn't do this with elite jumpers because I think people who practice jumping and are sand volleyball players or collegiate basketball players probably have already refined that mechanism. But if we take average people who don't do a lot of vertical leaping and we want to optimize their jumping, it's a very primitive pattern. It's a squat and extension. And what we did prior to them doing their 10 sessions of practice in jumping, jumping resistance on the lower body at a high level, or light resistance through the whole pattern as a refinement level, we measured their jumps 3 times. We get a audible cue, set jumps, so we got reaction time, plus we got the height they jumped on a good old Vertec device. And after they did their 10 jumps, they came back around the curtain and repeated the test. Now, obviously we're going to measure somebody's fatigue, but my professor said something that really changed the way I thought from then on. As we designed this test, all subjects, regardless of what group they were in, were told to go sit against the gym wall for 30 minutes to negate the physiological warm-up that they would have gotten from the 16 repetitions, 3 tests, 10 training, and 3 retests. They were brought back again and tested after a half hour of rest. And what we were trying to say is any benefit that was retained after that half hour might have been some neural reorganization, since core body temperature, respiration, tissue elasticity, whatever is there. We only had 10 repetitions of a learning opportunity, but if we engage the neurological system in a nonverbal way, with an obstacle it can't control without first refining itself better, we might figure out how to tap into that. And I think what you can see if you lean in and look is the people who had a light resistance and were not verbally coached, but were refined by the obstacle that was appropriate for them, had a 2-fold improvement in power. They were jumping better than they did initially, and they were also getting to the mark quicker. A lot of people think the highest vertical leap in the NBA is the prized one, but it's the person who gets the rebound, and sometimes that has as much to do with how quick your power is than how powerful your power is. That concept, reactive neuromuscular training, the brilliance of PNF and the observation that it occurs naturally and we could therapeutically use it in rehabilitation, said, why can't we operate on these principles in a hands-off way in training, conditioning, and corrective exercise? And that spurred reactive neuromuscular training in a paper that I did with one of my mentors, Dr. Mike Voigt, early in my career. And really, that reactive neuromuscular training preceded the movement screen. And what we realized with it was so powerful, many people were going to try reactive neuromuscular training on people with mobility problems. And that's the one group you don't do it to. You give them the freedom and make them own the control. And if they have mobility problems, you do not offer the opportunity to control, because when you're trying to control movement with a mobility problem, that's called compensation, and we don't want to train that. So we got to deal with mobility problems, but just on the other side of that, feeding the mistake, magnifying the error in a scalable way so they can grow their neurological system to own that freedom is exactly what we need to do. But they need to have a sense of that freedom, and they need to have that freedom available first. So you've got to clear mobility so the good stuff in motor control can work. Lee Burton and I followed up and put the term back out there again, but it was already part of our culture, and we were already exercising everybody we could in a more reactive way, realizing that most of the moves we're trying to train are at a subconscious level, and if they can't be reproduced above a cut point at a subconscious level, then people won't be able to do their jobs, do their skills, and their hobbies, assuming that balance, mobility, stability, and fundamental movement patterns are in their quiver all the time. They shouldn't have to think about the autopilot stuff. They should be thinking about the hand-eye, refined skill, and fine motor stuff, while the physical platform is aware of balance and space and time. So that RNT concept is a huge part of everything we do for motor control in our corrective strategies. And Eric DeGotti did a great job basically showcasing the exercises that we start pulling out when we get into FMS level 2 and people are doing the screen correctly, they're reading the signals of movement, and they're following the scale and they're following the system to go right to that constricted path. And we don't just tell you how to exercise. What Eric's doing right here is giving you case studies and real life examples of how if we just follow this movement model till we get them on the other side, we're designing better programming and never going back and having to do this continuous correction. Some people are probably going to need a little correction the rest of their life based on the injuries they've had or the lifestyle that they've come off of. But I am always inspired every time I hear somebody get through the corrective process, get on the other side of function, and now enjoy a workout that does not have to have 2/3 supplementation, mobility, and stability exercise just to remain fit, healthy, and pain-free. So I know some people will have correctives the rest of their life, but I think Eric, like myself and all of us here at FMS, the corrective is a temporary strategy to get you back to a more self-aware and functional lifestyle so as not to need them again whenever possible. Takeaway 3, functional adaptation is built on measured and positive responses with no insult to the movement system along the way. Now, how many of us have watched a drug commercial in the last 20 years and not heard one benefit and 32 different side effects you don't want to have? Well, it was just like us in the early days of the movement screen to cherry pick the test in the movement screen we liked, work on that because lunge looks a lot like the sport I'm working on, or push-up looks a lot like the thing I need to do, and worked on that. What we learned the hard way is by basically doing a full movement screen. After a corrective path, we got to see where we were robbing Peter to pay Paul. What do I mean by that? It's really easy to see shoulder mobility get better, but then lose neck mobility somewhere else or T-spine mobility somewhere else, and vice versa. So by taking a myopic approach in correctives, we would fix one thing only to cause a problem somewhere else. I can easily get a person who can't touch their toes touching their toes if I show them how to loosen their low back enough, but that's not necessarily the way I want to get them there. So following a scale and following the movement screen, we got to see every time we made something worse while trying to make something better. Many people only test what they're trying to correct. They never test what they're also trying to protect you from getting worse on. And that's why having a full array of patterns has kept us really humble and really close to the goal. Is we're not just quickly doing feedback loops on what we're trying to change, we're also monitoring feedback loops on what we do not want to get worse while we do this. Remember, the Hippocratic Oath extends over to coaching and training for most of the people that I like working with, and that's first do no harm. And if we don't know what to protect from and don't know how to watch those gauges as equally as we watch the gauges of success, I think we're going to take this population and do a lot more harm than good simply because they're not ready for most of the lesson plans we're good at giving. But with a little bit of onboarding and a little bit different on-ramp, I think we can get them there much quicker than just banging them around and letting that war of attrition select them out. My third conflict: how can we be custodians of this adaptive process if we cannot identify dysfunction and protect from the behaviors associated with it? And that was the central drive of the movement screen. It wasn't to complicate workouts or make us seem hyper vigilant about anything. I think we were very painfully aware that people were moving worse and exercising just as much, thinking that things would end well, and they just don't. Take it back to this equation. Mobility is easy to measure. Movement's not that hard to measure. Get certified in the screen and your reliability is going to be pretty good if you pay attention and do the work. But what to do when we're trying to fix motor control? Mobility, there's so much good information out there about how to fix mobility, but what you'll soon see is once you get mobility fixed, many times it's not sustainable, because under that mobility problem was poorly managed motor control or fatigue or poor proprioception that caused a constant tone or tightening of a body part because you were using it that way. So we all know that underlying many mobility problems that aren't precipitated by an injury is probably a motor control issue. Be ready for it, because on the other side of mobility isn't better movement. It's an opportunity to fix motor control so you can get better movement. So X equals reactive neuromuscular training. Simply shut up and feed them what they need at that level and let them make a few manageable mistakes that they can become self-aware of. And that's why we've started stacking a lot of our corrective exercises in paths. You'll see it in the level 2 course with Eric, where it's not just one exercise, it's the way we transition you and grow you, constantly not letting you get focused on just one pattern in one position, but owning that pattern up through the different postures of life. Now here's where everybody gets it wrong. The RNT exercise, reactive training, the nonverbal training, only works if you know the pattern you want to feed, the level at which it can take up, and you've already removed all the other risk factors. If you haven't slept in 2 days or you're dehydrated, I'm not playing with your neurological system today. It's already fried. And if I don't know that, the shame is on me, because you've got a powerful neurostimulant in these proprioceptive cues, and most of us are very, very informed about how to use this. But using them on the wrong person at the wrong time waters down and dishonors the technique, and that's just showing that we don't have that selective process. We get hold of a good exercise, we can't wait to share it with the world. The world ain't ready for this. Most of the world has mobility problems, but once you get on the other side of those, the problem's not over. They're going to have motor control problems, and this time, let's get them to learn it the right way, not with verbal cues. So, what other risk factors am I talking about? The people that you're not going to do these reactive trainings with: people in pain, people with breathing dysfunction, people with movement pattern dysfunction, people who have basically disrupted lifestyle, rest dysfunction, sleep and recovery, and then regenerative dysfunction, their diet, their hydration. Think of all the other things. I mean, we're looking at the risk factors right now associated with musculoskeletal injury, and when we come at this, there are a lot of other things that can complicate exercise other than a lack of knowledge of exercise or a lack of activity. And if we will be vigilant to these, you can actually see functional movement change by resetting breathing and getting somebody's lifestyle managed. And, you know, if they've got pain on a movement screen, the movement screen's done what it's supposed to do. They need somebody on the other side of healthcare that understands what the movement screen implies, and that they need a breakdown of that movement, because the way they're moving may be more associated with their pain than just rubbing some hot jelly on the area that hurts, okay? We don't chase pain anymore. We basically systematically look for all the things that could be pointing that way. And as we like to say sometimes, where your pain is may not be the source of your problem, but it is the area that we're very concerned about, because that's the way your body's signaling you of disharmony. If it is the problem, we'll know it just as soon. But very, very often, it's the way you're using that part, the functional stress that's on that part, that's causing the symptoms. So, are we aware of the risk factors that most people have when we're programming? And if they have a lot of risk factors, you won't even get a good response out of a corrective strategy. And that's where you need to go back and say, did I measure the right pattern? Did I offer the right path? Or is their system already fried and I came in too hot on a neurological system that's already half-baked and not ready for this? And I've done this early in my career. I was always sensitive to the people who were coming in, and I knew they'd been in pain, they're sleeping in a recliner, they hadn't moved a lot, and they were really jacked up in fear. And if we could get a couple of good nights sleep, we just picked up 3 weeks in rehab, because I'm not fighting the system, I'm flowing with it. So if you guys want to really understand the strategy that we're trying to get to with functional movement systems, all the little tests and screens and stuff we've thrown out there are simply gauges to watch. And if you're not watching them all at the same time, you won't know which one needs you. But in a common sense approach to evaluating movement and a common sense approach to correcting movement, that's what I try to share with the world, that, you know, whether you do our screens or try to make up your own, it doesn't really matter. You need feedback loops that represent your degree of professionalism. And I think we're beyond the level of all of us making up some functional tests. Use ours until you think of one better, and really see what you're missing, because a lot of times when we find mobility and stability problems, we don't fix them with exercises. We fix them by asking the hard questions about what's your work style and what's your lifestyle. And if I can make a few adjustments there, I'm going to keep watching your movement. If your movement gets better without me practicing this mobility or stability thing, I've already learned what to protect you from. Now watch how good the corrective works. And as I always like to end with, guys, if you really want to learn movement, you can stop listening to me now and go find about a 2 or 3 year old and watch them work through it. They're doing the exact same thing. Thank you. I think we're going to do some questions.
All right, we have collected some questions for you today, Gray. First, we're going to start with, what experience cemented the importance of the SAID principle for you specifically?
I wasn't using the terminology, but I was a barely average discus thrower in high school, and my dad knew more in the area about throwing a discus than some of the coaches at that time. So my dad stepped up and pulled off the minister's tie at afternoon track practice and was working with me and a few other guys because he'd been a pretty accomplished discus athlete, track and field athlete in high school. And right when football season ended, I just started hitting the bench press hard. But I was also proactive enough to keep throwing the discus. And I was doing both equally, but I was probably a little more enthusiastic about that bench press than I was the discus throw. And my dad commented after about 2.5 months, because we were getting into, maybe about 2 months, we were getting into the first part of track season, that I was looking bigger, but my throws were looking worse. And I realized that I had just made the assumption that just getting stronger on the bench press would actually make me a better discus thrower. But I wasn't really a arm-strong discus thrower in the first place. I was using my whole body in a full spin to do it. And so that was me thinking that everything I was doing in the weight room would carry over to something that was totally more global, 3D. And I realized that my dad said, listen, before you get into track season, just don't try to lift weights through track season. It makes you move differently. And that was the very first time, and I recalled that as I was going through a lot of my education later in undergrad and grad school, how he recognized that my movement patterns were looking more like push-pull and less like spiral and diagonal. Now, he didn't use the words of PNF, but he quickly articulated, you're getting bigger and stronger, but I can't see it from here. And that resonated with me. How many of us are practicing things in the weight room that aren't measurable when we run a 5K, and they're not measurable when we ski and swim and bike and do all the other things that engage us more? So make sure there's carryover in those exercises you're doing, or make sure there's a corrective measurement in those exercises you're doing.
Great. All right. You talk about proprioceptive cues and R&T. Is this more for rehab or for training?
Well, obviously, to me, that area is unbelievably gray because so many people coming out of rehab aren't ready for training. And so many people in training right now probably have some more rehabilitative or corrective things they need to be doing. And obviously, they can work both in rehabilitation, but I honestly think the carryover is when we find people in training that don't have pain, they don't need rehab, but yet their function is low. Not everybody can go running to their chiropractor or physical therapist. However, if you've been working on a one in the movement screen for months and it's not changing, there's probably something under there. But we see ones on the movement screen change pretty quickly if we unload them. We don't continue to stress them, we protect them a little bit, and then sort of really taper that focus just to see if things will change. And I'm a big advocate for saying, listen, let's stop doing everything for about a week just so I can see this budge. I'm going to let you do other activities real quick, but I can actually see or not see a change in a week if we're doing the right thing and not enough of the wrong thing. And sometimes I don't know what the wrong thing is. But I do know what the right thing is. So I'm like, let's quit doing everything, because it's not like you're going for an Olympic gold medal and it's not like anybody's paying you to do this. So if you really want an answer to your question, I can't see through the jar of water if I keep shaking up the mud in the bottom. But if I'll sit it down for a little bit, I can see right through it. And so a lot of times I will pull people back from far more exercises than I intend to keeping them off of. A lot of people can't handle it. Their habit is so ingrained that if we pull them off running even for a week, we can't see what we're doing. And those are people I'm like, well, go run somewhere else because I can't run alongside your car and fix it at the same time. But the correctives, if there's not an underlying medical problem, work so quickly, and they work even quicker if we don't tell them how to correct, if we use those cues. So they are designed and came from rehab, but because so many people in fitness right now could use a little bit of movement quality before they get more quantity, it's very effective there. The problem is with something like R&T, you have to have a scale like a movement screen or a Y balance test or a motor control screen to know which patterns to work on and then how to value how much it's changing. And remember, practicing the test is not necessarily what we're trying to do. We're trying to go in below that, reset something, and come back up and see that function changed without practicing it. And that's very important if you're going to try to establish what I call an objective feedback loop.
If reactive stimuli improves the movement short term, but the individual is unable to do the movement without it, what is your advice for making long-term changes?
That's an actual long way of asking a really good question. And what happens every time if I pull somebody off of correctives if they start backsliding? Well, right now, better to keep them on correctives. There's nothing wrong with the multivitamin. It would just be good if you were eating it as insurance, not because you'll easily migrate backward if you don't. But there are going to be people, especially people with previous injuries or long-term chronic dysfunction, that are going to probably need the corrective to be part of their workout forever and ever, amen. And I wish I could change it, but I'm not that good. So yes, expect for some people to probably have to hold on to these correctives for the rest of their life, but there's no reason we can't advance the complexity of the correctives and hold that line. But they will never be able to just get after it again because those days have passed. Take it from somebody who would prefer to get after it than do a few correctives. That's just going to be what some people have to do. Having said that, you'd be surprised how many people can get off of correctives and get onto a better workout, but it doesn't look like what they came from, and it doesn't necessarily look like what's flashy and sexy, and that sometimes has got more to do with ego and social presence than it does anything else. But yeah, you're going to have to change the way you work out, but there's no reason that people can't get after it. But there's ways we lift and train and offer up stress when we're on the other side of function, then we're actually creating dysfunction with some of our workouts. And so the best journey for me is not discovering meaningful correctives. It's actually learning how to wean people off those correctives and feel confident to say that, no, that's a great exercise. Not for you, not now. And I can have those conversations, and it's okay. You don't have to agree with me, but I can measure that behavior is not something that you want to entertain right now, because it's going to make more negatives in your life than it will bring positives to your function. So that's sort of the way we've tried to learn is it's not to get somebody on a corrective, it's to get them on the corrective so we can see that their system can change, and then it's to get them off the corrective so we can use activity, lifestyle to basically maintain that change the way it was intended.
And this is our last question. In FMS terms, can you give an example of how corrective strategies or the FMS approach offers a constricted path?
Yeah, it's actually a transparent path. Please hear that. When we treat and train people, those of us who work together to really try to honor this model and maintain the standard, we are transparent, meaning we set a baseline. That first measurement of balance or movement or the SFMA or any of the other physical measurements we do on you, that's on you. That's the way you showed up, and that's as honest as we can be about your local and global measures. What happens next is on us, and we realize we laid down a baseline. Now, when you lay down a baseline, it's really easy to practice the baseline, even if they don't know they're practicing, and make it look like everybody who you touch gets better. But I work with a bunch of smart guys, and the last thing I ever wanted to do was use my talent for BS to try to influence this experiment in movement. We try at all costs not to practice the test, but to practice the developmental sequence and the spiral and diagonal orientation of your anatomy and your neurological awareness and movement. And by taking you backward in pattern and by addressing mobility and stability at the point where it's the bottleneck, we bring you back up out of that. And that process helps us, I think, see if we're making a difference or not. So when I say constricted path, we actually had to make decisions. If you flunk every test in the movement screen, which one are we going to work on? Well, we answered that question. And there's a lot of good reasons why we answered that question, but the number one reason is we picked the pattern where you can make the quickest change that won't hurt anything else. And if you can see that change, you start to understand, I didn't just put you on a path. We revisited you and your movement, and without really practicing something, part of you changed just now. Now, the question is, well, how long will it stay changed? We've got to basically use this to wash that habit off of you. But that habit will soon go away if we quit causing that habit and start putting you up right against those obstacles that it created. So when I say constricted path, I'm not just talking about, I'm going to be a soup Nazi, you do these 5 exercises. What I'm saying is we basically use what we learned from this entire interaction and your movement samples. We put you right up against the obstacle, but in a way where we tell you to be aware, to monitor your breathing, and to explore the pattern this way. But at the other end, we're there with a retest, and that one's on us. And if you're not changing and you're not responding, then we're going to keep messing with that path till we demonstrate that the system is changing, hopefully without practicing the test. But we keep going back because once we hit that domino, if we get to the right domino, the rest actually start to go down. So that constricted path means we have developed an opinion over time of all things being equal, this pattern's most important, and all things being equal, if you're not aware of it, it probably won't change in a sustainable way. When we set up that path, there are certain milestones you've got to do, just like a baby developing, and we're going to check our work way quicker because we don't have that kind of time. So a constricted path has an objective baseline at each end, and you will know if the path is the right one. And we've held ourselves to that bar, so we have no problem asking you guys to do it because we ain't special, and you can figure it out too. So that's that.
All right, thank you, Gray, so much. And thank you, all of you, for your patience in watching today. And now, as promised, here is our special offer. Use promo code FMSLIVE40 for 40% off these products in our online store at functionalmovement.com. Also, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel and all of our other social media channels for the latest news, updates, and stories from FMS. Please drop us a comment and let us know what topics you'd like to see from us in the future. On our next live stream, we'll be here on May 7th with the owner of One Human Performance, Eric DeGatti. So mark your calendars, and we look forward to having you back. Until then, remember to move well, move often.